So hello, everybody. Very good to have you join us on this podcast. This podcast has the title Room to Grow, and we're focusing on the living sectors. Today, again, we're focusing on PBSA, and I'm delighted to have with me Joe Pericino from Yugo. Joe is someone I've known for many years in the sector, and he is well positioned to give us some interesting perspectives on what's going on globally in the student housing sector. Joe, probably best if I ask you to introduce yourself and to tell me what your role is today at Yugo.
Sure. Hi, Philip, and thanks for the invitation to join you on this chat. And hi to everyone who's listening and watching. My name's Joe. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Yugo Students. Yugo operates around 100,000 beds, including pipeline, across 14 countries across the world. So pretty well positioned, I think, to hopefully provide some insights and thoughts on the sector on a global scale.
And how does Yugo fit into the Dot Group family of companies?
So the Dot Group is the parent company, if you like, the umbrella company, which underpins four distinct arms of the PBSA sector. And effectively, it's what we call our ecosystem. So you have Yugo, which is primarily the operator of PBSA assets for owned assets, as well as for other clients across the globe. Yeah. We have GSA, which acts as the investment and asset manager. So we manage GSA's assets, but we also manage probably around a 50-50 split now between GSA owned assets and other clients. We then also have Kinetic Capital, which is a debt funding platform, primarily for PBSA, but will also venture into other forms of living, such as BTR. And then finally, we have student.com, which is, I suppose the easiest way to describe them is it's a student marketplace, which is akin to the booking.com of the student world. So they will have an inventory which includes our assets as well as many others. I think they're up to about 3 million different properties across the globe for many other institutional as well as private landlords.
It's an extraordinarily broad company, isn't it? A broad church.
It is. And, students are at the heart of everything that we do. And it's a very targeted approach and strategy in terms of trying to be the best that we can be and offering as much as we can across that ecosystem that I mentioned to students, but also to developers and to capital, ultimately. Yeah. As you'll have read in the press, we're about to complete on a French portfolio. So that's our first market entry into France. We've completed the acquisition of CRM in April of 24, which gave us exposure to some new countries that we hadn't been in before, but also cemented the scale in the countries that we're already in. So that allows us opportunities to really be efficient in terms of not just the people perspective, but also from OPEX perspective, and being able to use that scale to the advantage of our clients as well as ourselves.
Yeah, Joe, you really have, it strikes me more than ever actually listening to you. You've seen it from all sides, haven't you? You have got, it's a chip on each shoulder. You are very well balanced. You have absolutely the investor perspective, the user of investment perspective, the operational perspective, a lot of student interface work with the various companies as well, and going back to Unite with the development side of things as well. A tremendous way of being able to develop your expertise in the sector. I hope that others get the chance to have such a varied perspective as you have. And it's in a way what we're trying to do today with this is just to share some of those perspectives that you've gained. So perhaps if I can ask you, you've had with AXA and particularly now with Yugo, you have a very global perspective on student housing. Is it the case that there are one or two particular global geographical cultural things that have really stood out for you as game changers or sudden moments of awareness as to how goodness you need to do things differently in this particular market because otherwise it's all going to go badly wrong, or things that will go right. Be positive about it.
I think there's a number of things I've learned along the way, and I'm sure other people will say this, that one size does not fit all. It's not a cookie cutter approach. I think in the early days of expansion into Europe, there were accusations or calls for international operators and specifically UK operators that was unfair, or they were dubbed unfair in terms of trying to impose a UK model into other countries. And yeah, I think we learned that very quickly that just wasn't possible. One, from a legislative perspective, in terms of what you were allowed to build, was very different and is different across different countries in terms of space requirements and amenity space to room spaces and density, etc., etc. But also from the scale of what you could build. If I take France as the example, it's very difficult to find anything in Paris, for example, that's over 200 beds in terms of scale, and yourself that sub 250 and even sub 400 makes it very difficult in terms of efficiency and OPEX costs for something like that to work unless you've got scale and multiple.
And I assume, am I right in thinking that'll be due to the Haussmann architecture?
Exactly right.
Very traditional design. How can you can't really strip that out, and with great difficulty you strip that out.
Exactly right.
They do stick to that, don't they, very strictly?
They do, absolutely they do.
Yeah.
So then if you want the larger scale, and we've seen other operators do it, where you have to go further outside of the second ring of Paris to be able to get that scale, that presents different issues then in terms of the transport links, and will students be prepared to go further out, etc. So
this is it. I remember with Reza. So that first time that you were investing in Reza, we were, I think, pitching on that portfolio to buy it for someone, and I was struck by the much greater parental influence, the influence of the church, amongst other things as well.
Yes.
Then perhaps this has been diluted somewhat since, but in those early days, the issue of catered accommodation versus non-catered, issues over the size of beds, as in width.
Yes.
The issue of visitors from another gender coming at night and so on, all so different to what we were used to in the UK. And I do remember, because you've said about don't go with one size fits all, but I do recall thinking, I think Spain is going to change a bit. I don't see it all being catered halls the way it is at the moment going forwards, and probably there is some space for the cluster flat type model in the Spanish markets, where done sensitively and so on. Do you think, for example, just to use Spain as an example, that model has affected perhaps what students are prepared to go for, that they've moved away a bit from the catered? Or
I think it's definitely evolved. The catered was very much of a domestic requirement, and the first properties that we were managing and operating were very much catered towards that. And when you look at the stat, which is an important stat that we look at everywhere, is the percentage of internationals versus domestics, and especially those that are mobile. You could certainly see in the nascent markets across Southern Europe and even Northern Europe, it was the same in France, for example, that there was a far higher propensity of domestics to internationals, and therefore that does impact on your offering. Now, what we have seen is that the number of internationals has been and is increasing across those markets. And if we look at Spain, we now manage properties that are catered as well as those that aren't. And whilst the mix of student that is attracted to and wants to live in those properties will vary, we have seen, in Claraval, in a property in Madrid that we have there, 180 odd beds, it's very much international. It's the location of that property is just off a high street, lots of restaurants and bars around. It's a tight scheme. Catering couldn't have worked, and we see a lot of internationals that live there. But then if you move a bit further out into somewhere like Lope de Vega, for example, there are students that specifically looking for catering. And then you have a hybrid model as well. So you'll have properties that will offer it, as well as studios with their own kitchens. And
I'm sure we've seen
it's
quite an
moving.
evolution in the time you and I have been involved in the Spanish markets. Quite an evolution there, and of course, a lot more stock has been supplied, and it's moved from the tier 1 cities down to the tier 2, tier 3 cities. In France, can we mention the company that you're in the process of completing the acquisition of at the moment, or not?
I believe you can. It's been
I believe we can. I think so. You've seen that. It's been well publicised and a very exciting move for you. Do you think that we will see a similar evolution of the French student housing sector, not to one single sort of template of flats, which are clusters or whatever, but do you think that we will see, to some extent, a similar evolution as we've seen in Spain?
I think we'll definitely see an evolution. I've got the benefit of having worked and owned and managed a portfolio in France, because whilst at AXA we acquired the clay platform from Oaktree.
Yes,
so
that's right.
I've got the benefit of that knowledge, and I think France is very similar to a lot of those nascent markets where it was very much a residential product. There weren't any specialists in terms of the student space, so it was traditional residential operators that were managing blocks that so happened to have students in there. And it was, it sort of touches on the flex living point as well, where you've got students and then young professionals. There's a huge, what they call in France, a stagiaire market, so an interns market, an internship. So you were seeing a bit of a blended mix of students, but also the offering itself has come a long way from even 2019 when we acquired Clay at AXA, and that product was extremely different to what was being offered by Cruise and some of the other competitors. Studios, cluster flats were being implemented for the first time that weren't available or didn't exist. The idea of having amenity spaces and gyms and study rooms, etc., all of that came through, because previously there were pretty much residential blocks just with rooms. And so that has shifted and will continue to shift. Whether it follows the same path as Spain has, not so sure. I mean, you don't have the catered element per se in France, so that's one difference. But I think the expectation, and again, it's that education piece that I mentioned earlier. It's very much an educate. What is student housing, and how do you market it properly? How do you, and it's not just the students, but it's also to universities. I remember, when we first, while I was at GSA, moving into Germany and acquired the portfolio there, and trying to have a conversation with some universities, not necessarily about nominations agreements, but just to say, hello, we're here. We'd be happy to house your students, whether it's referrals or just getting onto your website. And they'd shoot you down and say, don't talk to us. We've got the Studentenwerken that cater for students. You do what you need to do. We don't need to talk to private operators. And that's slowly changed over time. And now you're having more of those conversations. But it's just unlocking those markets through that educational piece to say, we're not the bad guys here. We're not, we're just trying to solve a problem that every city in the world has in terms of housing these students.
You did talk about the fact that in Spain, initially, there were far fewer international students. And to some extent, that was true in France. Is it the case that makes probably it's seen as a bit of a safer proposition going forward? Because I think whilst we've all been very enthusiastic generally about the growing number of international students that we've had for many years, just at the moment, I think there's quite a bit of negativity around the threats globally, a little bit going on in the world, and a big exposure to international student numbers in any portfolio is seen perhaps as a little bit more risky than it used to. Certainly in the UK it is, I think. Any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important point to note is the nature of the international market. So back, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was very much concentrated on the Chinese market and Chinese students and wealthy Chinese that would always book studios, and that's all that they'd buy. So there was no risk of pushing your rental tone on those types of units. I think
Yeah.
what we've seen over the years, and certainly over the last 5 years, is that countries such as India and Africa are really coming to the fore more, and even Indonesia. So
Yeah.
we're seeing a much more blended approach to the students that are applying. But with that comes expectations and price point differences as well. So I think if your strategy is just purely based on high disposable income internationals, then I think it's flawed, because you're really only tapping into the top 1 or 2 or 3% of the
Yeah.
market.
Yeah.
You really need to diversify and be able to cater for all students, because, as I said, there's a wave. The Indian students have outpaced Chinese student numbers over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Almost double, I believe. So it's a growth area, and you need to, and we, us as operators need to adapt to that. And what does that mean in terms of the product mix, the room mix, but also the rental tone that you're offering
Yeah.
as well, to be able to attract them.
And what are your investors saying to you they want at the moment, really, for a good balanced portfolio? Have they got a particular perspective? Or, of course, they may be guided by you on this, but have they got a criteria for the balance of domestic, international, and other students?
It's really varied, and it really does depend on who the investor is. Some will have
Okay.
a certain strategy. I mean, it depends on the cost of capital, how long they're planning to be in the sector for. Is it, are they private venture capitalists that are just looking to develop, build, and sell and flip it effectively at the best price? Are they in it for
Yeah.
the long term, trying to create a portfolio of X thousand beds? So it really does vary, and there'll be some investors that really only want to focus on that high end, but they will be prepared to put the money where their mouth is in terms of delivering that high end product. And our role is to help them and guide them in terms of, is the location right? Is there enough demand in that area? What are the universities seeing in terms of numbers and international splits, and what type of
Yeah.
internationals are attending, to be able to guide them to say, right, this location for this number of beds will work for this high end product. And then there'll
Yeah.
be others on the opposite end of the scale as well, that just want to cater only for domestics because they see that as a safer harbour, if you like, and then everything in between. So it really is on a case by case basis with
Okay.
with our investors.
And in terms of future areas of growth for the company, clearly the Dot Group is very busy in the US. Are you getting the management roles on those assets, or is that partly split with others? How does that work out?
So we manage all of the portfolio in the US.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
about 18,000 beds, 40 odd properties across, I think, 26 states. And funnily enough, I was just out there last week, just visiting a few. And we're certainly, it's the largest market in the world, huge opportunity, and we're certainly looking to grow alongside our sister company GSA and our capital
And your
partner.
key takeaways from what the US market's looking at, key differences between there and here at the moment, let's say here, the UK and the US market at the moment?
Trump aside, I think
Yeah,
the key differences are, it is a very, whilst it's the same sector and effectively doing the same thing in terms of how housing students and delivering the best possible service, etc. It is very different in terms of, if I just think of how leasing happens in the States, very, very concession driven. So concessions or incentives, as we would say in
yeah,
the UK,
yeah,
very heavily concession driven from day one. Very, the parents do have quite a lot of influence. It's, and what I mean by that is not just that they foot the bill, but they will take a very keen interest. So it's almost a hybrid between the Spanish model of visiting versus the UK model of doing everything online. They're somewhere in between. They will visit, but they'll also do the online leasing part. And they're very, very, very focused on ensuring that their child has the best accommodation that they can afford and
yeah,
find.
yeah,
It's very serious in terms of, and not that it isn't elsewhere, but education in the States is extremely expensive
Yeah,
to actually attend university. So therefore, the housing that their child is in needs to be commensurate with that to ensure that they have the best chance of success for
sure,
that investment that they're making.
sure. And in other geographies, where are we going to see the next big push? I've heard mention of Australia. Um, where are you looking for the future for Yugo?
I think the biggest growth opportunities at present, other than Australia, which is a fantastic market for us to grow in, despite some headwinds potentially coming our way. But Asia Pac, so specifically Australia and Japan, we really want to grow our footprint there. We were first movers in Japan, have a couple of assets in Tokyo, 1 million students in Tokyo alone. But very
Yeah,
difficult from a real estate perspective in terms of density and availability or scarcity of land. Australia, we definitely want to grow in. It's a huge market, plenty of internationals, and actually flips it on its head. It's probably 90 to 95% international. And then in Europe, I think the real focus countries, the top two are probably Italy and Poland at the moment. We see some huge opportunity there. We've seen some real traction in Italy and just signed for another couple of assets in Poland to open in the not too distant future. So really encouraged by the growth there. And then clearly cementing and scaling our positions across the existing markets that we're in. France, we enter into in the middle of this year. And again, it's looking to add to that, add to those 3,700 odd beds that we'll have.
yeah, yeah. And are you finding any new clever ways of reducing running costs? Is that something which is you're always having the drum banged around from your board?
That question will always, well, it'll always come from internal as well as external. So from our
Yeah,
clients as well as our
yeah,
internal clients and the board, if you like. And yes, clearly that's a major factor because we've seen obviously post COVID spikes in pricing from not just the development stage but also the operational stage. We've seen wage increases that have been huge. It's been very difficult to recruit in certain markets and certain cities. Germany has proved very difficult, where wage
yeah,
expansion has just gone through the roof. So it makes it very difficult to recruit there at the right cost to be able to run an efficient building. But ourselves, we are looking very much at how we can streamline our business and be more efficient. And well that we've been looking at outsourcing. So some of the, without being derogatory, but the lower value add roles where you don't necessarily need the highest level of education or experience or knowledge of the sector to perform those tasks. We've looked to outsource those where possible so that we keep the real expertise in house to be able to focus on strategy and growth.
yeah, yeah.
We've been heavily looking at the use of AI technology. So we've been implementing that over the last 18 months across.
Is that for the booking process, or is that for the management of the
me.
buildings as well?
Yeah, so we've implemented AI into our booking process on our website specifically. We use true AI translation rather than the traditional Google Translate, which we find is 98% accurate, and opens us up to more languages. So I think we're up to 8 languages now that we've turned on our website. We're using AI in our finance function as well, in terms of reconciliations and making sure the numbers add up properly and are accurate.
Yeah.
Not that they weren't before, but it's far quicker in terms of the outputs that we can produce and reporting.
Yeah.
And then in our IT function, obviously we're using AI quite a bit and testing a few things. We're also looking to implement it into our human resource function as well. So how can we be more efficient? We're looking at it on training and development. We've started just testing AI training delivery across sites where it's effectively an avatar of yourself, but you can speak any language. So rather than having English as the spoken language with subtitles for other countries, if it's developed in the UK, we can have me as an avatar, and as soon as I open my mouth, Arabic can come out or Japanese, but it's me delivering it. So when people see us on town halls, for example, or on other meetings, it's a face that you recognize rather than just a random person that's training you, and that's gone down really, really well, and also helps us to ensure that the message is getting through 100% across the business. Because
except when you bump into these people in the street and then they're wanting to start in for a bit disappointing shock. Joe, I'm conscious that we're probably running over time. Can you just finish off by telling us two things, really? Firstly, what is it about what's going on in the world and what's going on in our sector that most worries you relating to PBSA? And then lastly, what is it that most excites you about the opportunities ahead? Because you seem pretty positive.
I'm always positive, otherwise I wouldn't be in this sector, and it's a great sector to be in. I think the headwinds or the concerns that I foresee are government intervention, increased government intervention. We've seen how it's played out in Ireland, for example. We've also seen it in the Netherlands. We're seeing it in terms of rental caps across Canada, for example, the proposed the proposed student number caps in Canada and in Australia. I think the more dabbling that's done in the sector, the more that could slow down investment potentially, as people seek to understand what will unfold. So that's certainly something to be wary of. But what excites me is that the numbers of students is increasing year on year. I mean, we're over 230 million students, I think, around the world today. Wow. Predicted to get to about 250 by 2030, and then by 2050 I think it's 400 million students. So the demand will always be there. Now, not all of those will be able to attend university, so what's exciting for us is that even if we get 1%, if we can house 1% of that total, I think we've been doing really well in a huge market. So I think the potential is absolutely there. I think there's more markets that will open up. There's potential for us to enter into regions and markets that capital might be a bit more reluctant to enter into, such as South America, India, South Africa, or Africa in general, that can open up huge opportunities, because the number of students, you look at India and the number of students that are in there is immense. So I think the outlook is very, very positive in terms of the numbers, but I think we as a sector have to ensure that we adapt to, as I said before, offer the right product at the right price in the right places. Very simple, it sounds like, but far harder to do. But certainly,
Joe, look, it really sounds that you are the right person in the right place at the moment. It's great to see your enthusiasm for the role, and actually for all the roles that you've had. And that's always been a feature, I think, of when I've met you. You've always been very enthusiastic about the things you're doing. So thank you so much for your time. And everyone else, thank you for listening to this podcast. And just finally, a big thank you to Joe Paraschino for all his time and perspectives on the student housing market globally. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, everyone.